and I'm calling out, light the fire again.
Good morning and welcome to the Inspire Conference workshop, Trends in Church Growth. My name is George Marchinkowski and I will be your host for this hour, the first 20 minutes in this online input session, and then the last 40 minutes or so in a Zoom or a virtual interaction session. So something occurred to me recently when I was preparing a sermon for a Sunday in March. The Lenten readings we followed for that particular Sunday prescribed John's account of Jesus chasing the merchants and the traders from the temple courtyard in John chapter 2 from verse 13 to 25. In the midst of this volatile interaction, which you and I know so well, Jesus jumps up on a table and chases them with a whip. And at the end, he says something which is sometimes missed when we preach on this section. John chapter 2 and verse 19, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now, it elicits an immediate response from the Pharisees and the temple priests. They can't believe that Jesus would be so blasphemous as to speak about the temple that can be destroyed, and then to be double blasphemous in saying that he will rebuild it in 3 days. Of course, the destruction part of that phrase, of that sentence, is a foreshadowing of what would happen in 69 AD, 70 AD, when the Romans, in response to an uprising in Israel, would finally destroy the Jerusalem temple. And of course, it has never been rebuilt even up to this day. And if you go there today, up on the Temple Mount, you will find the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but no Jewish temple. So there's that. And then, of course, the second part is Jesus referring to his own body, which is in some ways a new temple, which will be resurrected on the 3rd day. But it got me thinking about what kind of a upheaval the destruction of the Jerusalem temple was for the Jews in 69 and 70 AD. The Jewish people had been worshipping at the temple for generations. It was David who believed that a temple would be a fitting tribute to Yahweh as king. As he looked around to his neighbors, he saw ornate monuments and temples built to the Canaanite gods. And even further afield among the Persians and so on, there were temples and monuments. But the Jewish people's God did not have his own temple. And so David, and eventually his son Solomon, pioneered the building of the Jerusalem temple, which was then destroyed and rebuilt in the time of Nehemiah and the other settlers after the people returned from exile. And then Herod the Great spent 46 years extending the temple courts until it was at its largest and most ornate in the time of Jesus. Now, what would happen to the Jews if the temple was destroyed? Well, of course, they experienced that after 69 and 70 AD. And I wondered about that happening, and what would happen if our temples, the Christian temples, the churches that we've built, and the hierarchy of priests and ministers and moderators and bishops, and even our liturgy and all of the things we hold dear, which are not necessarily part of the gospel, which is a very simple thing, but all of the paraphernalia that we built around the gospel of Jesus. What if that should be destroyed? would we as a faith, as a people movement, survive? And what would make us survive? How would we manage? And then, of course, you think of the early church in those first 3 centuries after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And you think about how they survived, but not only survived, they thrived under very difficult circumstances, under persecution. What if this is a time where our temples are being destroyed in a post-COVID world, but also in a secular and a post-secular world in the last 30 or 40 years or so in the Christian West? Churches, cathedrals, religious buildings of all kinds have been sold, have been demolished. Congregations have died, grown older, and more sparse, and then died. What if this is just another destruction of the temple as Jesus foresaw in John chapter 2? What then? Is it possible that we might survive? So this is a time of great change. Very recently, I read some research from the Barna Group in the US and also the Pew Report. And those are 2 polling agencies, and they have come up with a statistic that 40 million Americans left church in the last generation. And these 40 million Americans largely fall into 2 groups. The first group are called the casually de-churched. About 10 million people, about a quarter of the total. For them, leaving was not intentional. Either they adopted new rhythms of life, which didn't include a Sunday service, or they moved neighborhood and didn't decide to join a church. Church no longer features in their week. Some of these were nominal or cultural Christians anyway, who carried the designation lightly, but some of them were from the Protestant mainline churches, while others were ex-evangelicals. The largest group in this American survey were African-American men who left church. And then the larger of the segments of this group, about 30 million of them, around 75% of the total, we call them the de-churched casualties. So there's the casually de-churched and the de-churched casualties. With this group, something happened, generally or specifically. Now, in America, often it had to do with politics. A particular politician or a party kind of adopted Christianity and started to preach a particular line, or a church adopted a politician and started supporting them, and this group didn't, agree, and so they fell out of it. The Cold War ending, a time of less fear in society, polarizing politics, as I mentioned. Some left because the internet exposed them to other worldviews and than the ones they grew up with. Perhaps they adopted another faith, or they constructed a blended view in which they adopted little bits of Christianity, little bits of other faiths, until they had their own bespoke faith made just for them. And then the polling in America suggested that there are 3 different kinds of levels of de-churched. The first one is those who just need a nudge and they'll come back, an invitation, and they'll be back in church. Secondly, those who need to be befriended by a church member, a dinner invitation or something similar, and they need to be encouraged. But after a while, and with some persuasion, they might come back. And then, of course, there are also those who are probably never going to come back, around 25% of that segment. One commentator, of course, referred us to those 3 Bs that we've spoken about before. He reminded us that as churches, we often expect people to believe, and our notion of belief is a very comprehensive one. They need to assent to every aspect of the creed, and then they need to behave. They need to behave like Christians, whatever that is, and finally we will allow them to belong. And of course, everyone who knows these 3 Bs points out that for Jesus, when you read the Gospels, often the belong happens right at the start. And having understood that the person belongs, they then naturally want to believe. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And then, of course, the last one is that the behavior also kind of falls into line with what Christ expects of us in the world. So, if that is the case, where do we go from here? Well, it's a time of tremendous change. And all of us who have been ministers in the church, and I'm talking about churches in suburbs, in townships, in rural areas, to a lesser and greater extent, have experienced decline over these last 20 years or so. We've seen churches that were thriving before, in some instances, battle. There are churches in our own presbytery where buildings have been sold because the congregation can't sustain it anymore. And smaller congregations who have had to either come together as a single united congregation, or congregations who have to share a minister between them because they can't afford the costs associated with full-time ministry. So it's a time of great change, and Alan Hirsch, the South African theorist on missional church, has said that we face an adaptive challenge. Like a cell, an amoeba cell that is graduating to become a more complex cell, we have a choice. Either we adapt or we die. In the similar way, the church has to do that. If the organism can adapt, it will survive, but if it cannot change, it will die. And there's certainly many churches, denominations or faith communities that did not survive the last 2,000 years of church history. Will we be one of them? Or will we be one of the cultures of Christianity, the denominations within Christianity that ultimately survived? Alan Hirsch writes, an adaptive challenge sets the context for innovation and adaptation, an extraordinary opportunity to discover ourselves in a way that orients us to a complex challenge in ways that are resonant with ancient energy. So, Congregationalists and Presbyterians are not the most flexible of Christians. Many Pentecostal and charismatic groups have changed their meeting venues, their worship liturgy, and their ways of doing church far more readily than we have. Many share their buildings in cost-effective ways with others, non-profits or other churches, even as shared workspaces. This may result in situations of a win-win. But whatever it is, the future will be different. And how can we? What are some of the principles that we can adopt, you and I, so that we can future-proof ourselves and work with God for the transformation of the world? One of the great themes that I've come to appreciate in missional church and in the theory of church growth is the notion of welcoming the stranger. It seems so plain and simple, but it is not necessarily so. Our faith is based on two love commands that Jesus gave, which he suggested summed up the 10 commandments and all the other commandments. The one is to love God with heart, mind, and strength, and the other is to love neighbor as self. The loving of neighbor as self poses a huge dilemma, especially for those who try to protect the boundaries of our community. And so Jesus then tells the story of the Good Samaritan to illustrate that the neighbor is the unexpected one and the one we least want to love, and the one who elicits the most prejudice from us, the Samaritan, as far as the Jew is concerned. Now, I don't know what that is for Christians. It may be different kinds of people in different contexts. But whatever it is, it involves unbelievers and those who have left the church, those who may even be alienated from the church, and those who may even be against the church completely. Let's tease this notion of welcoming the stranger out a little bit. In October 2019, I had the privilege of attending a conference on evangelism in Kansas City in the United States. It was run by the Presbyterian Church USA's 1001 New Worshiping Communities. And that body ran this conference in that city. And apart from all the wonderful input that we received and the group work we did and the brainstorming, there was an experience on the first evening of the conference that I will never forget. It was an invitation given and a very small group invited, because there was limited space, to what was called a dinner church. I had never encountered something like this before. And I was lucky enough to be one of the participants who was allowed to go and visit this dinner church. The meeting took place in a church hall. There were large round tables set for dinner and free seating. The meeting was opened with a welcome, and we took our seats. At my table were a cosmopolitan assortment of attendees. Two of us from the conference, a couple of professional people, a little old lady, and what turned out to be three homeless people, or maybe they just came from subsidized housing projects. We introduced ourselves to one another. One of the ladies was having a birthday that week, and the gathered church acknowledged her lovingly. We shared a meal. We listened to an artist speak. The regulars greeted each other and said they looked forward to meeting again next week. It felt like church, the beloved community, but with no pews and no pulpit and no visible ordained clergy. I sat there aghast, surprised to find such a diverse, unplugged version of church when all my previous experience had been traditional and inherited. I was baptized in the Presbyterian Church and have spent all my life here. Also, the demographics surprised me. They weren't all the same or similar. They were rich and poor, educated and ordinary, all having a meal together. And I began to wonder to myself whether this might not hold a key to the future of church growth in the UPCSA. We'll get back to that. One of the biblical stories that assists in fleshing out this model is a story that takes place in Genesis 18. Abram and Sarah hosting three strangers under the great trees of Mamre. Abram saw these strangers, and even although they were unknown to him and unrelated, he responded in warm and generous hospitality. He almost seems to be looking out for them, eager to offer them some generosity. It was the Oriental way, the way of Abram and his culture to welcome strangers. So he hurries out to greet them. He treats them as God sent and invites them into his home and company. They share a meal. He offers them an experience of basic decency and ends up producing a lavish meal. First, water was brought for washing. Then a shady place was offered for the guests to rest in the heat of the day. Bread was baked, a young calf prepared for eating. All this served with curds and milk. The strangers accepted the hospitality, and perhaps in gratitude, as a reciprocal gift, they offer their host some good news, a prophecy about the birth of a son. After the meal, they left because they had other business, and besides, Abram did not want to delay them. The story is simple, and it's often repeated in ancient communities. Hospitality was widely accepted as an important sign of civilization. In this case, however, the text identifies the three visitors as the Lord, big L-O-R-D, capitals, which of course is the Hebrew word for God. Therefore, the story takes on a deeper mystical meaning because it has become a story about the Jewish God or the Christian Trinity. Visiting humanity, being invited into a human home, and in an ultimate turning of the tables, divinity received hospitality from human hosts. It seems as if Abraham had entertained angels without knowing it. At its core, the story has the hallmarks of ancient hospitality: a shared meal, honoring the stranger, and accepting the outsider. Now, I could go on speaking about hospitality forever and the need of it, and I'm sure you will all agree with me. But how can we join the dots between hospitality as experienced under the great trees of Mamre in Genesis 18 and this gathered church, this dinner church that I experienced in Kansas City in the United States in 2019? And how can we then draw some principles that you and I can try in our local congregations? So in Somerset West, where I'm the minister, we have tried a pilot project. It's not perfect. It's certainly not flying on its own yet, but it's something, it's an experiment in which we attempt to recreate the story under the great trees of Mamre and the experience I had in 2019 in the dinner church. We invite people, and specifically people who are spiritual but not religious, people who are interested in faith but not interested in church, people who are not prepared to sit in a pew and listen to somebody in a pulpit, but are prepared to come around a table in a hospitable setting and listen to somebody speak about meaningful things. It happens on a Thursday evening, and people are invited to a simple meal. The meal is never lavish. It's always basically one course with a small dessert as a second course, a glass of wine, a glass of juice as your choice, and sitting at the table is one member of the congregation who acts as a host and who has been trained to draw people out, but nothing fancy, just encourage conversation, make people feel welcome, draw out the quiet ones, and enjoy the meal together. And so the hall is laden with various tables, 5, 6, 7, 8 tables at most, around 8 people at a table, a host from the congregation, but everyone else who comes is not a congregational member. This is not for church members. Sometimes a church member does come, but then they have to bring somebody with them, somebody who doesn't go to church, and that's their ticket in. And we invite a speaker. The speaker is someone from broader society, ordinary people, people who have walked the Camino, let's say, somebody who has been involved in meaningful things. We had Dr. Garth Jaffet from Soul City, and who was also involved in the Heartlines movie and campaign years ago, come and speak to us about telling a story. We've had people speak about their lives. Some people who were involved in giving sports teams pep talks and do so on the basis of some pretty challenging experiences that they've been through. Whatever the person, as long as the person is a person of faith and yet is able to speak without using religious jargon. They may not preach a sermon. This is not an evangelistic message. This is a sharing of a story of what God has done for them. And so the evening basically works like that. I welcome everybody. We have a meal together. The speaker speaks. There is a conversation around the table. They may take a question or two, and then we end the evening and everyone goes home. But we keep a database, and we encourage people who are sitting around tables to come again and form a community. Maybe this will be a way in which a congregation will form, a very different congregation, without hymns and without a Sunday sermon and without many of the trappings of our current traditional models. Maybe people will find faith around those tables. Maybe they will be community for each other. Maybe they will enjoy pastoral care. And maybe all those other things that we experience in church will be their experience as well, albeit in a different setting. Church without the church, perhaps. Another principle that has been very profound and found in many of the models across the world that are working is that we find something the community needs, and then we provide that need, and then church and faith arrive around that need. One of the stories I like to tell, and I've told many, many times, is of the congregation in Scotland, which decided to hire the building across the street from the church, a vacant shop, because they noticed that the young families, the young couples in the community didn't have antenatal classes, and they wanted it. And so they persuaded the district nurse to hold the classes there, and these couples began to come. And they met each other and became friends. And very soon, when the babies were being born, they added on a clinic facility once a week, and the district nurse would come again and weigh the babies and give vaccinations and do all those things that are done at a baby clinic. And then something more social. The ladies wanted to meet for tea and cake with the newborn babies, and the fathers wanted to attend as well. And there was a bring and share supper that was added, and gradually more and more things began to happen in that shop front hired by the congregation of the Church of Scotland across the street from the church. And eventually those families began to take an interest in the things of faith because their hosts were a Christian congregation, and they asked for a service to take place not in the church, the beautiful ornate Gothic church across the road, but in the shop front where they had found community and found each other. And that congregation had the courage and the strength to lock the church buildings, where there were only 5 or 6 of them left, and walk across the street where there was now a bustling and a vibrant congregation developing. Young people, families who wanted to understand faith. So they found a need and they built faith around that. And that today is a thriving congregation. So let me leave you with those thoughts. I've shared with you about hospitality. I've shared with you about the notion of the temple is falling. And what will we replace it with if the temple cannot be built again? The Jewish people survived as a faith even until today without a temple. We, I'm sure, will survive without the traditional trappings of church, if that is what comes. But what will remain, and what will we leave as an inheritance for our children and grandchildren? We'll talk some more in the in the discussion group on the online platform.